I should have known something was wrong with Walter Keene from the start. I think we all should have. But in a town like ours, small, quiet, the kind of place where people don't ask too many questions, you learn to let things go. You mind your business. Walter was just Walter. The weird guy. The slow one. The man who had been in the psych ward but came back. They said he wasn't dangerous. That he was just off. And for a while, we believed them. Until the day we found the first body. Walter had always been strange but harmless. He was 30 but acted like a child. He talked to himself, laughed at things that weren't funny, and had this habit of rocking back and forth when he got excited. If you passed him on the street, he'd stare at you for too long. But if you said hello, he'd wave like you were his best friend. It made some people uncomfortable. But nobody did anything about it. We were used to him. After all, it wasn't like he had always been this way. Walter had been normal once. Until 5 years ago. That's when he snapped. No one knows exactly what happened. One day he was fine. Living with his mother, working at the auto shop, just another guy in town. The next? Something broke inside him. There were rumors. Some said he had a breakdown after his mother died. Others swore he killed her himself and that's why they locked him up. All I know is that one night, the cops found him standing in the middle of Main Street, completely naked, covered in blood. Not his own. They took him to the hospital. Then to a psychiatric facility. And for 4 years, he was gone. Then, one day, he came back. The doctors said he was better now. That he was no longer a threat. So we let him stay. We let him walk among us. And for the first year, it seemed like they were right. Until things started going missing. It started with small stuff. People would wake up to find their garden gnomes missing. Their mailboxes ripped out of the ground. Their porch lights unscrewed in the night. Annoying, but not serious. Then it got weirder. Mrs. Carter found all her silverware missing one morning, but nothing else was stolen. Mr. Dean woke up to find every single door in his house unlocked. And then there was the dog. The Wilson family's golden retriever. Vanished from their yard one night. Turned up 3 days later, sitting in the middle of the church parking lot. Perfectly still. Perfectly silent. With all its teeth missing. That was the first time people started looking at Walter differently. The first time they started to wonder. But there was no proof. No one had seen him do anything. No cameras. No witnesses. Just whispers. And whispers aren't enough in a town like ours. So we let it go. Until the night Miss Avery went missing. She was 76 years old. Lived alone in a little yellow house on Pine Street. The kind of old woman who baked pies for the church fundraisers and knew everyone's birthday. One night, she was just gone. No signs of a struggle. Her front door was locked from the inside. Her car was still in the driveway. It was like she had just vanished into thin air. But we found something. In her backyard. Near the tree line. A single object half buried in the dirt. A silver spoon. From Mrs. Carter's missing collection. And next to it? Something even worse. A human tooth. Perfectly clean. Perfectly white. And when the sheriff picked it up, turned it over in his palm. There, etched into the enamel, in tiny, careful scratches, was a single word. Walter. After Miss Avery disappeared, our town changed. People didn't say it out loud, but we all knew who was responsible. Walter Keene. For years, we treated him like a harmless fool. A man-child who wandered the streets, muttering to himself. Someone to pity, not fear. But Miss Avery's disappearance was different. The silver spoon. The human tooth with his name scratched into it. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was a message. And we had been ignoring the signs for too long. The sheriff, Jim Thompson, was the only one who seemed ready to do something about it. He started watching Walter more closely, following him at night. Walter had always been a wanderer. He'd pace up and down Main Street at all hours, staring into people's windows, sometimes talking to himself. But now? Now he wasn't just wandering. Now he was waiting. Sheriff Thompson told me what he saw one night, and I haven't been able to sleep since. Because that was the night Walter finally spoke to someone. Someone that wasn't there. It was just after midnight. The sheriff had parked down the street from Walter's house, keeping his lights off. Walter had been outside, standing in his yard, rocking back and forth. Nothing new. But then he started whispering. At first, the sheriff thought he was just talking to himself. But then something whispered back. Sheriff Thompson told me the words still haunt him. Walter, is it time? The whisper, soon. Walter, they don't see yet. The whisper, they will. That's when the sheriff did something he probably shouldn't have. He got out of his car. Started walking toward Walter. Walter must have heard him because he stopped whispering. Stopped moving. And then, he turned. Not fast. Slowly. And the sheriff swears he wasn't alone. Standing right behind him in the dark just beyond the glow of the street lamp, there was a shape. Too tall. Too thin. Something that moved when Walter moved. But when the sheriff blinked, it was gone. And Walter? He just smiled. Then he said something that made my skin crawl. "You should go home now, Sheriff. You don't want to see what's coming." The sheriff wasn't the only one keeping an eye on Walter. A few of us, me, Deputy Kelly, and Mr. Dean from the hardware store, had started watching, too. But Walter must have noticed. Because one night, he disappeared. Gone. His house was empty. No one had seen him for almost 2 days. And then, at exactly 3 a.m., the sheriff got a call. A woman was screaming on Sycamore Street. By the time we got there, we saw what she was screaming about. Walter was back. But he wasn't alone. He was standing in the middle of the street. His arms stretched out wide. His head tilted back. And surrounding him on the pavement, the sidewalks, the driveways, were dozens of dead animals. Dogs, cats, rabbits, even a deer. All laid out in a perfect circle around him. All missing their teeth. Walter just stood there smiling. The sheriff stepped forward, gun drawn. "Walter, what the hell did you do?" Walter giggled like a child. Then, in a soft, sing-song voice, he said, "I didn't do it, Sheriff. They did." And he pointed at something behind us. Something that wasn't there. Something that had been watching all along. The night we found Walter standing in the street, surrounded by all those dead animals, was the night we stopped pretending. Something was wrong with him. Something we could no longer ignore. Sheriff Thompson arrested him on the spot. No handcuffs. No struggle. Walter just let it happen. Smiling the whole time. He didn't ask why. Didn't try to explain himself. It was almost like he knew this was supposed to happen. And when the sheriff locked him in a holding cell at the station, Walter sat down on the cot, folded his hands in his lap, and said nothing. For the first time in his life, he was quiet. And that made it worse. That night, no one slept. People locked their doors. Pulled their curtains closed. Parents kept their kids inside, whispering things they didn't want them to hear. Because deep down, we all felt the same thing. We had waited too long. And now it was too late. The next morning, Sheriff Thompson called me and Deputy Kelly into his office. He looked like he hadn't slept at all. His shirt was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot. He gestured for us to sit. "Walter's not talking," he said, rubbing his face. Kelly and I exchanged a look. "And?" I asked. And the sheriff exhaled, "I want to know what the hell he's hiding." That's when he pulled something from his desk drawer. A small plastic bag. Inside it, a single, human tooth. My stomach turned. "Found it in his pocket when we booked him," the sheriff said. I looked closer. The enamel was scratched. At first, I thought it was just scuff marks. Until I realized it was letters. Etched into the tooth. Avery. My skin crawled. Miss Avery. Gone without a trace. And now we had a piece of her. Walter wasn't talking. He sat in that cell for hours, smiling. Watching us. Not blinking. Every time we tried to question him, he'd just start rocking back and forth. At first, we thought he was messing with us. But then I noticed something. Walter was listening. Not to us. To something else. At noon, Sheriff Thompson made a decision. We're searching his house. Deputy Kelly and I didn't argue. Walter's house was exactly like you'd expect. Run down. Dusty. The kind of place you could smell before you even walked in. The living room was full of junk. Newspapers stacked to the ceiling, broken furniture, dirty clothes. But the kitchen? It was spotless. The counter was clean. No dishes in the sink. Everything lined up perfectly. Too perfectly. Like it had been arranged. And that's when I saw the first red flag. A jar. Sitting on the kitchen counter. Full of water. And inside, floating at the bottom, more teeth. The sheriff didn't say anything. He just picked up the jar and set it on the table with a heavy thud. Then we kept looking. We searched the bedroom. Nothing. The bathroom. Nothing. And then we checked the basement. That's where we found it. Walter's collection. At first, we thought it was just dolls. Hundreds of them lining the walls. Sitting on shelves. Their plastic eyes staring into nothing. But when Deputy Kelly stepped closer, her breath hitched. These aren't dolls. I moved in beside her. Looked closer. They were mannequin heads. Styrofoam. Cheap. The kind used in department stores. But the faces. Each one had been carved. Some had eyes drawn on with marker. Some had wigs taped to the top. And the mouths? Every single one of them had real human teeth glued inside. Hundreds of them. Some crooked. Some yellowed with age. Some far too small to have come from an adult. My stomach lurched. What the hell is this? Kelly whispered. The sheriff was stone-faced. He turned back toward the stairs. Bag everything. That's when I saw something else. Something new. Tucked away in the corner of the basement. A single, fresh mannequin head. No eyes. No hair. But a mouth wide open, waiting. And next to it a set of pliers. And a brand new row of teeth neatly placed beside it. Walter had been working on this one. And if we hadn't stopped him, someone else's teeth would have been added to his collection. Back at the station, the sheriff slammed the jar of teeth onto the metal table in front of Walter. Walter didn't react. Didn't even look at it. Where's Miss Avery? The sheriff asked. Walter rocked back and forth, smiling. I found your basement, Thompson continued. I found your little hobby. No reaction. The sheriff leaned in close. Who's the next one, Walter? Walter's smile widened. And then, in a soft voice, almost playful, he finally spoke. You'll see. That night, Walter escaped. The deputy watching him swore he never unlocked the cell. Never even looked away. But when the sheriff checked the security cameras, the footage was missing. Just static. Walter was gone. And the last thing he left behind? A single tooth sitting in the middle of the cell floor. And carved into it? The sheriff's name. Walter Keene was gone. He vanished without a trace. No broken lock. No footprints outside. No sign of how he got out. 1 second he was sitting in his cell, rocking back and forth. The next, an empty room, except for the single human tooth he left behind, with Sheriff Thompson's name carved into it. That was his message. Walter wasn't just escaping. He was playing. And now it was our turn to run. That night no one slept. The sheriff issued a town-wide lockdown. Every house locked up tight. People sitting with their lights on, guns loaded, listening for any sound outside. We all knew what Walter was capable of now. And the worst part? He was out there, watching, waiting, and he had a plan. Around midnight, I got a call from Deputy Kelly. Her voice was shaking. Get to Sycamore Street. Now. I didn't ask why. Didn't waste time. I grabbed my coat, my shotgun, and drove like my life depended on it. When I pulled up, the sheriff and Kelly were already there, standing in the middle of the road. Their faces were pale. And when I stepped out of my truck, I saw why. Every house on the street, every single one, had their front doors wide open. All at the same time. Not kicked in. Not broken. Just open. Like Walter had walked down the street and knocked on every door. And they had all let him in. Sheriff Thompson was the first to move. Gun raised. He stepped onto the nearest porch, calling out, Mr. Delaney? You in there? No answer. Just silence. He motioned for us to follow. We stepped inside. And the house was empty. No blood. No struggle. The furniture was untouched. The TV was still on, playing a talk show. There was even a half-eaten dinner on the table. It was like the Delaneys had just stood up and walked out. Like something had called them outside. And when we checked the rest of the houses, they were all the same. Not a single person left on Sycamore Street. Just open doors. And a town that felt emptier than ever. Back at the station, we tried to make sense of it. 27 people. Gone. No signs of struggle. No calls for help. No explanation. Then, at 3 a.m., the police radio crackled. And a voice came through. Not Walter's, but Miss Avery's. The woman who had gone missing first. The woman we all knew was dead. Her voice was weak, flat, like she was speaking from somewhere far away. Help me. The sheriff grabbed the receiver. Miss Avery? Where are you? A pause. Then the same voice. Help me, please. My stomach twisted. The static shifted. And then, in a voice that was barely human, we heard it. Laughter. Soft at first. Then growing louder. Not just one voice. Dozens. Walter wasn't alone. And whatever he had done to those people on Sycamore Street, they were laughing with him. We tried to track the signal. Tried to find where the call was coming from. But the coordinates didn't make sense. The system was placing the call in the middle of the cemetery. And when we went there was nothing. Just rows of graves. And 27 new holes in the dirt. Freshly dug. Waiting. The next morning, a new tooth appeared. Not in a cell this time, but in the middle of Main Street. right in front of the sheriff's office. Carved into the enamel was a single word. Tonight. Walter was coming back. And we weren't ready. Walter Keene was gone. We had no idea how he escaped. No broken locks, no signs of forced entry. It was as if he had just slipped through the cracks of reality and vanished into the night. But he hadn't gone far. We knew it. Because he left a message. A single human tooth in the middle of Main Street. With one word carved into it. Tonight. Walter was coming back. And this time he wasn't playing games. The town prepares. Sheriff Thompson wasn't taking chances. By sundown every officer in town was armed. Checkpoints were set up along the roads. We locked our doors, turned on every light, and waited. But the air felt wrong. Like a storm was coming, but there wasn't a cloud in the sky. No wind. No insects. Just silence. And then at midnight the power went out. The whole town plunged into darkness. And we heard the first gunshot. I was in the police station when it happened. The radio crackled to life, a frantic voice on the other end. Officer down. Jesus Christ, he just walked right up to the house. Took M. I need backup now. Static. Then nothing. The sheriff grabbed the radio. Officer, repeat that. Who took who? Silence. And then from outside it. Screaming. We ran. Straight into hell. Every house on Sycamore Street had its front door wide open. But this time the homes weren't empty. They were full of people who didn't belong there. Families in the wrong houses. Mothers clutching children that weren't theirs. Neighbors staring at each other like strangers. Some of them were crying, shaking. Others were completely still. And the worst part? None of them remembered how they got there. Deputy Kelly grabbed Mrs. Carter by the shoulders. Ma'am, where's your husband? Her lips trembled. She looked down at the floor. And then, in a quiet voice, she said, I think he's in the walls. We checked her house first. Her husband, Mr. Carter, was nowhere to be found. His wallet was still on the kitchen table. His shoes by the door. But him? Gone. Then we heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping. Coming from inside the walls. Sheriff Thompson grabbed an axe from the truck and started swinging. Chunks of drywall fell away, filling the air with dust. And then, a hand fell out of the wall. Limp. Cold. I staggered back. Kelly gagged. The sheriff dropped his axe. Because inside that wall, curled up like a child in a coffin, was Mr. Carter. His eyes were wide open, bloodshot. His mouth stuffed with cloth. He had been buried alive. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was his fingers. Because when we pulled him out, we saw that they were bloody. From scratching at the inside of the wall. From trying to get out. Walter had planned all of this. The people in the wrong houses. The bodies hidden in the walls. He had been moving among us in the dark. And we never even saw him. Until the sheriff found the final note. A scrap of paper tucked inside Mr. Carter's mouth. Written in tiny, careful handwriting. You never watched me close enough. We never found Walter. Not that night. Not ever. He was gone. But sometimes, late at night, people still hear scratching in their walls. And sometimes, someone goes missing again. Because Walter isn't finished. He never was. And maybe? He's still watching.